Hi, I'm Steve Frank, Vice President of Education and Exhibits at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. I was the project director for the center's exhibition Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War, which debuted at the center in Philadelphia in 2005. We're delighted to be partnering with the American Library Association and grateful for the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities to be able to bring this exhibition to your library. For the next few minutes, I'll be taking you through the exhibition to explain how it's organized. The exhibition looks at the Civil War through Lincoln's eyes. And when Lincoln looked at the Civil War, one important way he viewed it was through the lens of the Constitution. The Constitution both empowered what he could do to deal with the rebellion and constrained him. From the perspective of the Constitution, the Civil War posed three big questions: one about secession, one about slavery, and one about civil liberties. The exhibition is divided into three major pods. The red pod deals with the question of secession. Was the United States truly one nation, or was it a confederacy of sovereign and separate states? The purple pod deals with the issue of slavery. How could a country founded on the belief that all men are created equal tolerate slavery? The maize pod deals with dissent and the issue of civil liberties. In a nation in crisis, would civil liberties be secure? Before we turn to those issues, let's meet Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln embraced photography, which was a fairly new technology in his age. We have lots of documentary evidence about what Lincoln looked like because he liked to be photographed, and he photographed himself at every important stage in his career. The top photograph here was taken in 1858, at about the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This photograph was taken in 1861, when he first became president. For all his life, Lincoln had been a beardless man. But as he was campaigning for the presidency in 1860, a young girl, Grace Biddle, who was 11 years old, living in Westfield, New York, wrote him a letter suggesting that he grow a beard to look more distinguished. She wanted him to win the election. Lincoln replied that he had not had a beard all his life and that it would be a silly affection to grow a beard now. But in the end, he took her advice. And between his election in 1860 and the time he took office in 1861, he grew a beard and became the Lincoln that we recognize today. This photograph was taken in 1864, just shortly before his second inauguration. And finally, this photograph was taken in 1865, toward the end of his life, by Alexander Gardner. The succession of photographs shows the burden of office and what Lincoln went through as he struggled to save the Union. Lincoln was elected president in 1860 with less than 40% of the popular vote. Most people knew him as a politician from Illinois, but didn't know very much about him. This illustration appeared in Frank Leslie's magazine in 1861, shortly before Lincoln was inaugurated. It was one of the ways the American people were introduced to who their new president was. They knew that he wanted to stop slavery from expanding, but they didn't know how he would do that or what that would involve. This illustration shows Lincoln being sworn in as president by Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the United States. The Bible that Lincoln used is the same Bible that President Obama used when he was sworn in as president. The first major section of the exhibition deals with the crisis of secession. For Southerners, the Union was a confederacy of sovereign and separate states. States that had ratified the Constitution could take that ratification back and secede from the Union. Northerners saw the situation differently. They believed that the Union was perpetual, an act of the people. The story continues around the other side of this panel. 7 states, beginning with South Carolina, had already seceded from the Union by the time Lincoln took the oath of office. For Lincoln, secession was a fundamentally undemocratic act. He had won the election fair and square, and to secede from the Union was to reject the will of the majority of the people who had elected him. When Lincoln arrived in the Oval Office for his first day as president, he found a note from Major Anderson, the commander of the garrison at Fort Sumter. The garrison was running out of supplies. Lincoln had a decision to make. Would he resupply the fort? His decision to resupply the fort was a fateful one. When the attempt was made, the Confederacy attacked, and the war had begun. Lincoln was a controversial figure in his time, and one of the reasons for the controversy was the strong actions he took as president. When he took office, Congress was out of session, but he felt he had to act. He called out the militia. He authorized spending money to equip soldiers. He authorized martial law, all without the approval of Congress. Eventually, Congress authorized these acts, but it still remained very controversial. And one of Lincoln's greatest acts as president was to stand for election in 1864 when he thought that he would not be reelected. He felt that to suspend an election in wartime would have been to violate the very principle for which he was fighting, the principle of democracy and majority rule. And this is a picture of Lincoln at his second inauguration. He was already starting to be stalked by John Wilkes Booth. This picture shows John Wilkes Booth in the balcony above the podium where Lincoln is giving his second inaugural address. The next section of the exhibition deals with the crisis of slavery. When Lincoln came into office, he felt that the Constitution constrained him and that he couldn't abolish slavery in the states where it existed. He found during the course of the war that as president, he had powers as commander-in-chief that would allow him to emancipate the slaves. But how that came about is the story that's told on the other side of this panel. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation as a matter of military necessity. That's why it freed slaves only in those places that were still in rebellion. One of my favorite stories about Lincoln is about the day he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It was January 1st, 1863. There had been a New Year's party in the White House. His hand hurt from all the hands that he had shaken at the New Year's party, and he was concerned that when he signed the proclamation, his hand would shake and that it would show irresolution. So he put the pen down, steadied his hand, picked it up again, and signed boldly. If my name goes into history for any act, he thought, it will be for this act. Lincoln understood that to abolish slavery permanently required a constitutional amendment. He was so elated with Congress's passage of the 13th Amendment that he signed the document, even though presidents have nothing to do with the constitutional amendment process. Congress proposes amendments and the states ratify them. The Senate was so concerned with the fact that Lincoln had signed the document that they officially reprimanded him for doing so. But it was Lincoln's greatest legislative achievement, and he couldn't resist. Here we are in the section of the exhibit that deals with civil liberties. If the 13th Amendment was Lincoln's greatest constitutional legacy, how he dealt with civil liberties was his most contested. He was branded a tyrant in his time for trampling on individual rights, and scholars still debate whether the measures he took were justified. Let's find out what all the controversy is about. Lincoln dealt with issues of civil liberties that we're still arguing about today. This panel deals with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which protects people against illegal arrests. Lincoln suspended the writ many times during the course of the war. He felt it was a military necessity. The problem is that the right to suspend the writ during times of insurrection or rebellion resides in Article 1 of the Constitution, which deals with the powers of Congress. So the question then, and the question now, was, does the president have the right to suspend the writ? Let's see what other civil liberties issues Lincoln had to deal with. This final panel in the civil liberties section deals with Lincoln's record concerning freedom of the press. Lincoln felt it was his duty as commander-in-chief to support the Army by stifling criticism that induced people to desert. The policy became very controversial, and he defended it in a famous pamphlet. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert? When we organized the exhibition, we had to decide how to end it, and we thought that the most appropriate ending would be at Gettysburg, where Lincoln summed up the meaning of the war in 272 words. This side of the final exhibition panel has a black and white image of Gettysburg at the turn of the 20th century. On the other side of the panel is a color image of Gettysburg today. And there, in an exhibition where we asked questions that Lincoln had to answer, we asked patrons to answer a final question for themselves. Lincoln's address at Gettysburg summed up in 272 words the meaning of the war for his generation. It was also a challenge to future generations. And at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, we asked visitors to think about this final question. Has America lived up to the ideals Lincoln fought for? Equality, freedom, democracy. We hope that patrons at your library will think about that question as well.